Thanks for checking out another project video. My name is Mitch and this is Made by Mitch. Today I'm going to show you how I made this custom guitar pedal board. So let's check it out. This video was a collaboration with West Coast Pedalboard, who provided all the electronics for this project. Links for all the parts I used and their website are in the description below, but I'll tell you more about them when we get to that part of the video. I started my project with rough cut lumber, but you could get yours that's already milled to rough size at a lumber mill or even at a big box store, depending on what kind of wood you want to use. But what I did to mill mine down was first cut to rough length, and then I used the table saw to cut it to width, and then now right here I'm using the joiner to get one flat side, and then I would do the opposite side through the planer to get a square board. So the next thing I have to do is I have to rip the sides of the pedal board, and so I've made a mark for the back and then the front along the side, and I'm going to be using this tapering jig that I made to make the cuts. Now this is the first time I've used this jig, and I'll link a video in the description here how I made this, so let's see how it goes. After I made my marks, I lined it up with the edge of the jig where the blade would run through, and then I tightened down the taper. And then I could just use these clamps to tighten this board down using a piece of scrap wood and then run it through the table saw. This jig was a lot easier to use than I thought it would be. I'm going to make a video on this if it's not out yet. It will be soon. I'll link it in the description below. Next, I measured the angle of the taper, and then I replicated that angle on my table saw. And then I can use this to rip my front and back boards, that way it matched the taper of the side boards. Okay, so the next thing I have to do is join the box together, and to do that I'm using box joints. Now I referenced David Picciuto's video on how to do box joints. This table saw doesn't handle a dado stack, so I'm using the single blade box joints or the finger joints. This is my first time doing this, so it's a big learning curve for me. Now I did do a ton of test cuts. I actually made a separate board just to figure out how to do the angles and different things like that to make sure that I could do this right. And this took a lot of practice for me to really get it right. So I would encourage you to do the same. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on how I made this jig. I am going to show you what I did, but there are a ton of different ways you can join boards like this. You don't have to do this finger joint method if you don't want. You can just do standard butt joints. You can do mitered corners, whatever you want to do. You don't have to do this method. I just wanted to show you what I did. So for the box joints, the first thing I did was mark all the pieces and where I wanted them, laid them out how they would fit together, and then I used this jig which had a little notch, and so I would make my first cut and then I would move the board using the notch as the guide for the next cut. And then when you piece all these together, they fit. And again, it took a lot of tests, trial and error to get this to fit perfect, but it worked out great. Okay, let's see if it fits. So my battery died, but it fits. Woohoo! And next was the glue up. And so it was just as easy as adding glue to all the joints. I used this little piece of scrap wood to get in between all the fingers to have as much glue contact as I possibly could in all the joints. And then I clamped everything together as tight as I could, and then make sure you wipe off all the excess glue, that way it doesn't leave a mess once it dries. Next, I can sand these joints down to be even with the rest of the board, and then I went in and made this paste out of glue and sawdust just to fill in some of the cracks, the imperfections of these joints. Then I sanded everything up to 600 grit. Next, it was time to start working on the top of the pedal board, so I used 1/2-inch plywood for this. I just laid the pedal board down, traced it out, and then cut that out with a circular saw. I used the same angle as before to rip one side of the top, that way it would match the rest of the pedal board. And then I added the hinges to test out the fit of the top. Once I knew it fit, it was time to take it back apart and then start installing the electronics for this project.
Getting all these parts from West Coast made this project so much easier. They have tons of pedalboard DIY kits, accessories, wiring harnesses, and much more. Links for all the parts I used in this build will be in the description below. I'm making another video where I show you in more detail of how I installed the electronics of this, but in this video I'm just going to give you kind of a brief overview. But I just followed the instructions that came along with all the parts from West Coast. And the first thing I had to do was just drill the holes for all the different parts to go into on the outside of the pedal board. You can get single plugs and adapters and cables if you want, or you can just buy these harnesses that come pre-assembled that they make for you. Once all my holes were cut, I can test to make sure everything fit the right way. Next, I used a router and a 1/4 inch roundover bit to go around the outside and corners of the pedal board just to give it a little bit better of a look. I ripped a piece of wood to put in the front of the pedal board, that way when you step down on the pedals it didn't completely fall through and would be a little more stable. I also added a couple of these little blocks on the back, that way the top would rest on all 4 corners. It also gave me a place to drill in the feet later on in the build. After this, I applied 1 coat of Danish oil. I let that dry for a couple days, and then I put 3 coats of polyurethane on this, sanding in between each coat with 600 grit paper. Now it was time to get back to the top of the pedal board to finish it up. First, I drilled holes for my toggle switch and LED light, and then I used a router on the other side just to get rid of that space for those to fit in these holes perfectly. Next, it was time to make the holes in the top of the pedal board for the cabling to come up through. So I drilled holes all over the top of the pedal board using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, and I'm creating some slots for the cabling to go through. So I used a jigsaw to connect where these holes would be to cut out my places. I also created a place in the front and on the sides for your hand to go down and pull the pedal board up. And after that was all done, I sanded everything down to 220 grit, and then I painted the bottom of this black. I put Pedalboard Carpet on the top of the pedal board using spray adhesive to attach it to the pedal board. This is also from West Coast Pedal Board, and this stuff is amazing. It was really easy to install. I just followed the instructions on my spray adhesive can. Now all the parts were in place and it was time for the final assembly. So I attached the hinges back on, and then I decided later on to install some magnets just to hold the top of the pedal board down. This really actually was a great addition to the pedal board, so I'm glad I did this. And while I'm putting this back together, I wanted to take a second and thank all my patrons over on Patreon, especially the top supporters. Thank you guys so much for your continued support on my channel. I really appreciate it. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, I'll leave a link in the description below. Thanks so much, guys. Next, I could install the bottom of the pedal board. Now I just used a piece of 1/4 inch plywood for this, and I attached it using the screws for the rubber feet, and then also a couple other screws just to hold it in place a little bit better. This thing turned out way better than I thought it would turn out, and it is by far my favorite project to date. Not only is it beautiful, but it's also very functional. I love the on-off toggle switch and the old school lamp, having the power in the side of it, and then the capability to open it up and wire all your pedals. It just makes it super functional. I love the way this thing turned out, and I'm really excited about it.